And well, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's LPLS talk. I'm Eric Blair. I'm president of Leeds Phil and Lit, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Westland tonight to talk about does color exist. I guess color is an omnipresent thing with us. It's almost that we may not even notice it, but I think it's probably guiding us towards things in the supermarket and many things. And Stephen has been researching over this from a whole number of point of views for many years. So we're looking very much forward to hearing what you've got to say, Stephen. Thank you again for joining us tonight. And I'm going to hand over to Rachel Unsworth, our event secretary, to introduce you.
Thanks, Eric. So the study of colour has come a long way since the formation of the Department of Dyeing at the Yorkshire College of Science back in the late 1870s. And Professor Westland's work has moved on very far from beyond that. And it's not within any one discipline. It encompasses how colour is produced, how we perceive it, how it can be measured, how the insights can be applied. And in a digital age with the use of machine learning. So he's interested in such topics as whiteness and blackness, as well as the whole array of colours in between, including the measurement of subtle differences in the colour of teeth. And he likes both conceptual and practical challenges and is interested in design as well as the scientific aspects of colour. And the psychological elements. So following academic posts at the School of Neuroscience at Keele and the School of Engineering at Derby, he came to Leeds in 2003 to take up a chair in colour science and technology. And will he manage to convince us that either colour is out there or that it's all a trick of the light and of our eyes and brains? We're looking forward to hearing from you, Steve. I'm just going to mute myself and I'll.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eric and Rachel, for your kind invitation and introduction. So, does colour exist? Well, there's a very short answer to that question, which is yes. We could make the talk very short. It would be very strange as someone who studied colour science for 40 years if I was to argue that colour doesn't exist. But the longer answer, and what I really want to talk about today, is whether colour is a property of the world, or is it simply our response to properties in the world? And I'm not the first person to think about this question. So Isaac Newton famously said that the rays, to speak properly, are not coloured. In them, there is nothing else than a certain power and disposition to stir up this or that colour. So he clearly was of the view that colour is a perception, not a physical property of light. Before him, and even more dramatically perhaps, Democritus said, by convention, we have sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention colour. But in reality, there is only atoms and the void, also making the claim that colour is a perception. So is it a property of light, or is it a perceptual response to light? So I should say that I believe it's very much a perceptual response to light, not a property of light. And there are lots of books and websites which agree. So in this particular one, which is a SPIE publication, it says light of different wavelengths produces different perceptions of colour. So I like that a lot. This one, however, which is an educational website in New Zealand, at the top it says, each wavelength is a particular colour. Each wavelength is a particular colour. And, I don't know whether the person who wrote that webpage or not, was of the view that color is a perception or not. But the problem with the language, each wavelength is a perception of color, is it implies that light doesn't just look colored, but it is colored, that the color is a property of the light. And of course, whereas it's easy to accept that something like pain is our response to the world rather than a property of the world, our everyday experience is such that it certainly seems as if things are colored. It seems as though the bananas are yellow and the grapes are green, rather than just looking yellow and green. And I think a certain looseness of language, and also this experience we all have of color, has led to a number of misunderstandings. And I found this video online. I want to show you, play you maybe a clip of maybe about 20 seconds from this video, which I think really encapsulates very, very well the misunderstandings people have. So let's open it up.
You see, here in this room, this lemon is subtractively yellow. It absorbs all visible wavelengths of light except for yellow light, which it reflects onto my retina. But the screen that you are using to watch this video doesn't produce yellow light at all. In fact, it can only produce red, blue, or green light. The really cool but kind of disturbing thing about this is that here in the room, I am actually seeing real yellow light, but you are seeing fake yellow. Absolutely no yellow is coming off of your screen and falling on your retina, but it's still.
Okay, so for me, one of the disturbing things is that that video has actually got 21 million views. And he basically makes the claim that when we look at yellow on a screen, it's not real, it doesn't exist. And what I'm going to do in this talk, I'm going to introduce 4 axioms that I think you have to believe if you're going to take that view. And I'm going to show with measurements and data in the main, why I think all of those axioms are false and what should replace them. And in doing so, I'll be certainly addressing the question at the end of whether color is real or not. So the first axiom is light is colored. So unlike Newton and Democritus, I think that person believes that light is colored. He also believes that colored objects absorb all the wavelengths apart from those of a particular color which they reflect. And this is a really, really common assumption. You actually see it in lots of textbooks. You see this statement. The third one, which he stated quite explicitly, is emissive devices like our displays only emit red, green, and blue light. And therefore, when you see yellow on screen, it's just a trick. And the fourth one is that some colors, for example, yellow, generated on emissive displays or devices are not real. That's basically the framework which he believes in order to make the statement that when you look at yellow on screen, it's not real. I should just say that in this talk, I might occasionally refer to red and blue light. And when I do that, just note, I will be, as Newton said, speaking improperly, because by red light, I mean light at certain wavelengths that looks red. And I simply do this occasionally to avoid having to always pedantically say phrases such as light at wavelengths that look red to us. But when I say red light, that's what I mean. So the first one is light is colored. Is that true or not? Well, on the left is a photograph that was in the news this week. It's Manchester United played Middlesbrough in the FA Cup, and they famously changed the color of their socks from black to white in order to make it easier for someone who is colorblind to distinguish the two teams. So on the right, you can see a simulation of how the image would look to someone who only has 2 cones rather than 3, someone we'd call colorblind. And you can see the difference between the shirts isn't as large on the right-hand side as it is on the left-hand side. And because United have got white socks, not black socks, it makes it a little bit easier to distinguish the teams. But for my talk tonight, I want you to just note that if you're colorblind, and about 8% of the male population in the world are colorblind, then the picture on the left looks like the picture on the right to you. And therefore, which one of these shows the true color, and how can we justify that decision? And you may say, well, it's us, that is the rest of us who have 3 cones. But actually, recent research has revealed that as many as 33% of females actually have 4 cones, maybe tetrachromatic. And they may see the world in quite a different way to how we see it. So it's not at all clear that we can say that these things are a particular color at all. And if we ignore color blindness and just say, are the 2 circles here the same color? So I'm just going to move the background so you can see that they are physically the same. But are they the same color? Your screen is emitting the same wavelengths in both cases. Is it an illusion that they look different? If you believe that light is colored, then you'll say the colors are the same color, but they just look different because of the background. You'll call it an illusion. If you believe that light looks colored, then you might accept, as I do, that if 2 things look different in color, they are different in color. I think those 2 color circles are different in color, despite being physically the same, because I define color as something perceptual. We can take some quite extreme examples of this. In this case, you have the 2 physically identical hearts shown at the bottom, but seen through this grid of yellow and blue lines. You can see that the heart on the left appears much bluer and the heart on the left much yellower. And this is interesting because here we have contrast, which is things take on the opposite color of the background. And here we have actually something called assimilation, which means colors become more similar to their background. But the contrast can be temporal as well as spatial. So if you look at this diagram and just try to fix your eyes on the cross and don't move them, what you should see is a green circle rotating round. Physically, there is no green. What's happening is each purple circle is disappearing, and as each one reappears, the next one in sequence disappears. As it reappears, the next one in sequence disappears. And what you see is the opposite color of purple and magenta, which is green. So this is contrast in time. So the colors we perceive don't just depend upon the colors surrounding them in space. They also depend upon the colors that we've been looking at just previously, temporal contrast. And you can have some quite complicated cases of that, of the contrast effect. So in this case, on the right-hand side, these yellow patches are physically identical to the blue patches on the left. So if you were to print this out and say, why does this yellow patch here look yellow and why does this one look blue? A chemist may say, oh, because the one on the right's been printed mainly with yellow ink and the one on the left's been printed mainly with blue ink. But when you actually just mask the rest It's worth just saying, if you don't mind, if you could turn your mics off, because sometimes you get a little bit of noise and it's just hard for people to hear, if you don't mind. Unless you want to raise a comment or question, which is, feel free to turn it on at that point. So mute yourself if you can. If you actually mask the rest of the image, and if you don't believe this is true, take this image, which you can easily find on the internet, print it out on your printer, and cut out the yellow patches and cut out the blue patches, and you can see that whereas a chemist may look at this and say, oh, this yellow is produced mainly with yellow ink, and this blue with blue ink, not at all. They're both produced with a little bit of black ink. And a physicist might say, oh, this screen is reflecting mainly short wavelengths. And over here, this screen is reflecting, this yellow patch, mainly long and medium wavelengths. But no, they're both reflecting the same wavelengths. Which makes you ask the question, when you see this yellow on the right and this blue on the left, where is the color coming from? Or where is it being produced? And whatever you conclude the answer to be, I would argue that is the same process or the same source for all of the colors that you see all of the time. That is simply how color works. And in my opinion, color is produced by the brain in response to light which it perceives through the eye. I often say to my class, how many colors are there in this design? Including the white, of course. And you may say, well, 5, 2 pinks and 2 greens. Of course, you can show, as I'm going to here, that the 2 pinks are physically identical. And the 2 greens are physically identical. In fact, maybe it's helpful to say in the above image that it contains 3 physical colors, red, green, and white, and 5 perceptual colors, 2 reds, 2 greens, and 1 white. I quite like that way of talking, but I do have colleagues who get quite angry with me for even using the term physical color. But I think it helps a little bit with a diagram like this. So whenever I start a new class at University of Leeds talking about color, I always ask the question, how many colors are there? And what's interesting is it produces a range of answers. Within 10 minutes, somebody always says there's an infinite number of colors. Somebody says there's 3. Somebody says there's 16 million. And recently I gave this talk at the University of Goldsmith, and someone said, there aren't any colors. They don't exist at all. So we had answers from 0 to infinity. And then I say to them, how many countries are there in the world? So I don't know if anyone here knows. I had to look it up on Google. It turns out to be round about 186. It's not a precise number because do you count Scotland and England, for example, as separate countries or not? It depends a little bit on your definition. But nobody says there's only 3 countries or there's an infinite number. And that's because we all share a common understanding about what the word country means. But when we talk about color, the problem is we don't share a common understanding about what it means. It looks like somebody could be drawing on the screen there, but it's okay. I can't do anything about it. So some people say that the 2 circles here are the same color, but look different in color because of the background. To be honest, I can accept people who agree with me that color is perceptual, and I can accept people who say that they think color is physical. But actually, this statement is hard to accept, and the reason for that is they're using the word color in this sentence with 2 distinct meanings. Because what they're saying is the 2 circles are the same color. So they're using color as a physical definition there. but they look different in color because of the background. Well, they're using the word color as perceptual. So two definitions of the same word in the same sentence. It's a bit of a mess. It's almost universally accepted by scientists that color is a perception. But I have to say that this first axiom, light is colored, is perhaps the most difficult one, because philosophically, there's always a little bit of room for argument. And I think most would conclude that color is not an intrinsic property of light, which is the term that philosophers often use, but it is at the very least, it's a relational property, even if it's not a property that we entirely generate ourselves. So I'm going to reject the axiom that light is colored, and I'm going to replace it with another axiom I call B1, which is light looks colored. That's what we should be teaching, not that light is colored, but light looks colored to us, if you like. You could say, well, aren't I being pedantic? And isn't it very philosophical, and aren't I a practicing scientist? Well, it's the opposite. I've worked for 40 years in color with loads of companies on loads of practical problems. I've never met a single company who has any concern or interest in what you might call physical color. They're all interested in perceptual color. So after my PhD in 1986, I started working for a company called Courtaulds Research, and we produced fabric for Marks and Spencer. And on the left, you can see an illustration of a representation of the garment we had. It was a red and gray top and a green and gray skirt. You may say, that's unbelievable, Steve. There's no way anyone would wear that. But what you have to remember is this was 1986. The sort of things people wore in 1986 was very different to what people wore now. So this was the sort of garment we were talking about. And I'd just been appointed with a brand new PhD in color physics from Leeds. And I was brought out to talk to Marks and Spencers who were complaining about this garment, because what they said was the gray on the bottom of the garment didn't match the gray on the top. And I was there to explain that it was okay, because I took a spectrophotometer and I measured the color of the gray at the top and the gray at the bottom. And it doesn't really matter what these numbers mean, but they specify the color and they're the same. So it's the same gray in that regard. And they weren't very impressed. And then I took some scissors and I cut out some of the gray from the top and some of the gray from the bottom. And I put them side by side and showed them like they were physically the same. That it was just an illusion that they looked different. And you know what they said to me? They said, Steve, we're not interested. We're just not interested. They said, are you going to stand in our store? And incidentally, Marks and Spencer started, their very first shop was in Leeds, in the market. They said, are you going to stand in our stores on the customer complaints desk? And when people come in and say, the two grays on this garment don't match, are you going to say to them, don't worry, they're physically the same. It's just an illusion. It just won't work. And what we had to do, we had to make the two grays physically different to account for the contrast effect so that they would look the same color. That was my first lesson post-PhD. The color was much, much more complicated than I had thought it was. Second very practical example I can give you is after I left Courtaulds, I was asked to go back for this problem. Courtaulds at the time sponsored the McLaren Formula One car. And this is the Courtaulds logo on the tail fin of the car. And they were spending millions for this and doing huge deals in hospitality tents and things like this. And they said to me, there's a problem, Steve. A lot of our customers and clients are saying why is the white of the Courtaulds logo so dull compared to the rest of the white of the car? What's going on? And you can guess what was going on. Physically, this white here is the same as this white. What you've got on the tail fin is assimilation taking place. So the two whites look different. In fact, they are different. And what we had to do, we made a fluorescent transfer, which we stuck onto the tail fin. This is, I just mocked this up because I couldn't find the photo of it. We stuck it onto tail fin to make it physically whiter than the rest of the car, because it basically emits fluorescence, so that they would actually look the same. And I remember standing at Brands Hatch, even now I can remember it to the day, in the pouring rain, watching this car going around the track, hoping that the transfer would stick to the tail fin, which it did, of course. And I could give you 20 or 30 examples like this, where if you rigidly believe that things have a fixed color, if you think that things are colored rather than just looking colored, you will end up with a whole host of problems. Second axiom is that colored objects absorb all the wavelengths apart from those of a particular color which they reflect. So the diagram here shows you what people think. These are the wavelengths of white light falling on the object. The object absorbs all the ones apart from the yellow ones. And remember, by the yellow ones, I mean those wavelengths which we would normally see as yellow. And we see the dress as yellow. This is a very simplistic way of understanding color in reflective objects. It's consistent with A1. If you believe, I should say that if you believe A1, if you believe that light at 580 nanometers is yellow, then you might also believe that if you see yellow light, then it is light at 580 nanometers. So you get diagrams like this one on the right. This is in an undergraduate textbook about color, which clearly shows the idea that the object is reflecting only yellow light, that is light at about 580 nanometers. It's 560 to 590, see over here. To be fair, the illustration on the right in the book, they go on to say that this is a simplification, but the problem is by even presenting this diagram, I think people will just see this and believe that's what happens. The one in the middle is from another textbook for undergraduates. And again, you can see the idea that this time an orange surface absorbs all the orange wavelengths apart from the orange ones, which it reflects. Now, is it true? Well, we don't have to speculate, because in my lab, I have a machine, several actually, called a reflectance spectrophotometer. And what this machine does, you shine light upon it, upon a sample. It measures the amount of light reflected by your sample. And you can work out the percentage of light reflected at each wavelength. If we take, for example, a yellow dress or a lemon, and we do that, we get this. So the object, this dress, reflects about 85% of all the light above about 530 nanometers. So in actual fact, because the reflectance is greater than 0 at every wavelength, you can actually say that this dress reflects all the wavelengths between 400 and 700 nanometers, the visible spectrum, to some extent. And because the reflectance is not 100 anywhere, you can say it absorbs all the wavelengths to some extent, but clearly it mainly absorbs down here in the short wavelengths. But it simply isn't true that this object only reflects the yellow wavelengths. It reflects the orange wavelengths and the red wavelengths And actually, most of the green wavelengths, just as much. And in fact, it also represents about 30% of the cyan-looking wavelengths and about 10% of the blue wavelengths. If you are one of the people who believes that light is colored, what you should be asking now is, why does this dress look yellow at all, if it's not only reflecting yellow light? So in actual fact, this is a more realistic diagram that we should be showing in textbooks, which is inconsistent with A2, that colored objects absorb all the wavelengths apart from those of particular color. It's also not supportive of A1. Interestingly, there are many ways in which things are colored. The color of things like oil on water, or the colors you get on a butterfly's wing, have very specific mechanisms. But most of the things around you, whether it's your teeth, your skin, your hair, your clothes, your walls, your textiles, they operate by absorption processes. So for example, a yellow t-shirt might reflect all the light that falls upon it, which is why it looks white. But there'll be a dye stuff added to it then, and the dye stuff absorbs light of a very specific wavelength. And it does this because the molecule, the dye molecule, goes from a ground state to what we call an excited state. And that is a quantum of energy that this dye molecule can absorb. And as we move along the spectrum from the red to the blue end, the packets of energy, the photons, if you like, get higher and higher in energy to move from right to left. So depending upon the gap, the energy gap between the ground state and the excited state, we will get a very specific wavelength of light absorbed. However, we never see materials that behave that way. And the reason for that is the molecule in its excited state or its ground state can rotate, that the atoms rotate around each other. And as the molecules rotate, they become higher or lower energy states, which means that it isn't just that energy, meaning that wavelength, the molecule can absorb, it can absorb all of these wavelengths. And then in addition to the rotational levels, each of those, the molecule can vibrate. These are called vibrational levels, and they give us other in-between wavelengths of light that can be absorbed. And so we end up with absorption spectra that always look pretty much like that. And there's a fantastic paper by Larry Maloney in Journal of the Optical Society of America, 1986, where he talks about this. Very, very nice. So because a yellow dye stuff absorbs strongly in this region, its reflectance curve looks somewhat like this that I'm showing there. And this fundamental way in which matter and light interact means that it simply isn't possible. It's not simply that things generally don't reflect single wavelengths or even narrowband wavelengths. It simply isn't possible to make most materials that do that. This is a database I have of 400 objects where I measured the spectral reflectance. And you see that none of them emit anything like a single wavelength. Reflectance is always varies smoothly with wavelength. So I'm going to replace A2, the idea that colored objects absorb all the wavelengths apart from those of a particular color. And that was rather central to that earlier video's claim that he said the yellow lemon was reflecting light at 570 nanometers and pretty much nothing else, right? It's not what's happening. The lemon reflectance is rather like this. I'm going to say colored objects tend to selectively absorb some wavelengths more than others, and energy is not absorbed, it is reflected or transmitted. is a more reasonable thing to say instead of A2. A3 is that your display only emits red, green, and blue light. So on the left, you've got an example of what's called additive color mixing. If I had been able to come to the Leeds Institute to do this talk, I would have got two lights, a red and a green light that are quite narrow band, shine them on the wall, and then move them so they overlap. And where the red and green overlap, you get yellow. If you were to do this with single wavelengths, it's very difficult because you'd need lasers. Even then, it's very difficult to get single wavelengths. But if you did do it with single wavelengths, you measured the green, measured the blue, measured the blue. What would happen when you measured the yellow? What would you measure? Where the red and green light overlap and they've additively mixed to make yellow. What do we mean by additive mixing? It's actually a terrible misnomer. There's no actual mixing. It's not as if the red and green wavelengths of light mix in some magical way and produce single wavelength yellow light. If you measure the yellow light you can see there, you simply get single wavelength red and single wavelength green. By additive mixing, we simply mean coincident in the same space. That's all it is. The mixing, if you like, if you want us to call it mixing, occurs in your eye. And I'm not going to go into the details of how that occurs, although it is actually quite interesting. But effectively, you can have single wavelength yellow light, which is our physical stimulus, and you can have an additive mixture, we can call it, of single wavelength red and single wavelength green, and they both can look yellow because they both produce identical cone responses in the retina and hence are indistinguishable. The visual system has absolutely no way to detect which wavelengths or even how many wavelengths are present. It would see these two physical stimuli, even though they're very, very different, as the same. So this is the principle of additive color mixing, and it's the idea that you could actually make a device, for example, which here I should just say that if you do the same thing with the white here, a lot of people say that white is the presence of all the wavelengths. It doesn't need to be. You can additively mix as few as 2 wavelengths and get white. And in this case, if we additively mix these 3 wavelengths conceptually and measure what's there, we simply get the 3 wavelengths here, but they produce the same cone responses as, for example, this stimulus does. And so you get white. On this principle, you can make a device that emits red, green, and blue light and additively mixes them, in other words, overlaps them, or so close together we can't resolve them visually. And you can make a range of colors. And it's on this basis we have color television, cinematography, mobile phone displays, arguably even regular photography, although that's slightly different. Most displays are based on primaries that look red, green, and blue. But here's that distinction again. If you think that light is colored, and you see this on the left, you will assume that the red primary is only emitting red light, i.e. wavelengths that we would consider red. The green primary is only emitting the wavelengths we would consider green, and the blue one. So when you see yellow light, remember the guy in the video, he said, your display is not emitting any yellow light. Is it true? Is it true that these displays only emit light at the wavelengths that we associate with red, green, and blue? Well, we don't need to wonder about it because, again, we have an instrument at Leeds. This instrument is called a spectroradiometer, and it measures the spectral distribution of the light emitted from the screen. And actually, Marjan Vazirian, who's actually in the audience, I notice, for her PhD, she measured the properties in incredible detail for a huge number of displays. Here's one such display. It shows you the light emitted when your iPhone 13 displays a white screen. Now it's true, right, that here's the red primary and its peak emittance, yeah, it's in the red region, the green one in the green region, and the blue one in the blue region. But if you were to just show the blue one, it goes like this, and then it comes down like that. The green one goes down like that. In fact, you can see that even though it doesn't emit a huge amount of yellow light, it's simply not true. It is simply not true that the primaries of your display only emit red, green, and blue light. What they emit is light that looks red, light that looks green, and light that looks blue. The green primary, for example, emits quite a lot of cyan light, actually quite a lot of yellow light, and a little bit of orange light. The red primary emits quite a lot of orange light and some yellow light. So again, I'm going to change axiom 3. Emissive devices only emit red, green, and blue light. I'm going to say most displays emit light that looks red, green, and blue to create a range of colors. The distinction is huge, in my opinion. It's not just subtle, it's a huge distinction. The final claim is that some colors, for example, yellow, generated on emissive devices are not real. So we can look at yellow in a rainbow, and you might get relatively, or pass light through a prism, for example, like Newton did. And you might get a relatively narrow band of light, physical wavelengths that together look yellow. Or you could measure or look at a yellow dress or a yellow lemon, and you get a reflectance like this. Or you could look at the yellow on a display, and they're all completely visually indistinguishable because they all produce the cone responses. We have 3 cones in the eye, one sensitive mainly to short wavelengths, one mainly to medium wavelengths, one mainly to longer wavelengths. And these lines represent the activations of the cones. So all of these 3 stimuli activate the L and M cones very, very strongly and approximately to the same degree. And all of them don't activate the S cones very much at all. So all 3 generate the same cone responses in us. There's just no basis for thinking this one in the middle is any more real than the one on the right or the one on the left. And certainly there's no basis for believing the one on the left is not real and the one on the right, the lemon that the guy was holding, is real. Because it just isn't the case that the yellow lemon or the dress is only emitting yellow light in the first place, or light that is yellow. It's emitting light that looks yellow. Interestingly, Newton observed something pretty interesting about the spectrum. So he was one of the first people, if not the first person, to make a hue circle. He took the spectrum and realized the long wavelength end was looking rather similar to the short wavelength end. And he bent the spectrum around like this and created a circle. He realized there were some hues missing. So some hues, such as yellow, can result from seeing single wavelengths like this, or from combinations of wavelengths like that or like that. However, some hues, such as purple, only occur with combinations of wavelengths. There's no single wavelength that corresponds to this hue of purple. So I've often seen people making the claim that a color like pink or purple isn't real because it's not in the spectrum, because they believe in A1, right? But the purple you see when you have two wavelengths present is no more or less real than the yellow you see when you look at a lemon or a dress in real life. Not only that, you can also think of colors such as brown or pink, for example, or beige. So you often hear people saying the spectrum contains all the colors. It doesn't. It contains all the visible wavelengths. It contains all the wavelengths of light that look colored. But the vast majority of colors we see in the world result from seeing combinations of wavelengths, which can either be produced on a display or can be produced by physical objects. The only time you ever see single wavelengths is arguably a rainbow, a prism, if you try to replicate Newton's experiment, or possibly a laser. So I've been told by laser specialists that it's actually really, really difficult to make a single wavelength laser. Even lasers are relatively broadband compared to what we might want them to be. So all the colors you see are like this. So colors, whether seen with reflective objects or on emissive displays, are perceptions. This is a better axiom than the one before. So to me, just to summarize that, if you're going to claim that the yellow on a screen is not real, you have to also claim that the yellow dress or the yellow lemon in real life is also not real. And the only colors that are real are those you see in a rainbow. But it's not a logical stance. You know, all of these processes, all of these stimuli generate color in the same way, that is through activation of the cone responses. You either have to accept they're all real, or they're all they might be in your imagination. I mean, I think they exist, but they're not properties of the physical world, if that makes sense. So these are the axioms. Light looks colored to us. Colored objects tend to selectively absorb some wavelengths more than others. Energy is not absorbed, it's reflected or transmitted. Most displays emit light that looks red, green, and blue to create a range of colors. Colors, whether seen with reflective objects or on emissive displays, are perceptions. This is a nice basis for teaching color at schools or universities. I could have talked about some other issues, some other misunderstandings which occur. So, for example, this is taken from the BBC website, and this is actually their revision notes for GCSE in the UK. And it makes three statements. The primary colours are red, yellow, and blue. They cannot be made by mixing other colours, and all other colours can be mixed from red, yellow, and blue. And some of you will remember being taught this at school. But actually, one of those statements is not true. And if we were in a room now, I'd ask you to say which one you think is not true before revealing it. But you can just do that in your head and think, well, which one do you think is not true? And the answer is, actually, trick. In my opinion, none of these things are true, and none should be taught. And of course, I've complained to the BBC, but to be fair to them, this is actually what is in the syllabus. But I could give a similar lecture to the one I've given today to show that these things are not actually true at all. And I'm not the only one who thinks this way. So I'm part of a group of people called the Colour Literacy Project, which is supported by the Inter-Society Colour Council, which is mainly an American organization, and the AIC, the International Colour Association, which is an international Association for Colour, which runs annual conferences. And we have an aim, a long-term mission to raise the level of common knowledge about colour in order to facilitate colour communication across disciplines and increase awareness of the important role colour plays in our everyday lives. And in fact, we're working on the development of a new syllabus to be taught at junior school, which would actually teach colour properly and would avoid a lot of the misconceptions I've been speaking about today. But it's really quite a challenge, because sometimes people say to me, why do you get so angry about this, Steve? And I say, well, imagine if you were a geologist, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, but imagine if someone said, the world is flat, the earth is flat. And the geologist might just say, okay, fine, people might think that. But what if they said to the geologist that they're teaching in schools, they are teaching in schools that the earth is flat? Then the geologist might get slightly angry. And that's how I feel, because they are teaching children that the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. They are teaching children that they can't be made by mixing other colors together, even though you can print out from a CMY printer red and blue, which are made by mixing the CMY primaries together. They're teaching children that all of the colors can be mixed from red, yellow, and blue, when it's completely evident that they cannot. And they're also teaching the other more sophisticated, more difficult misconceptions, such as, for example, that light is colored rather than looking colored, even though Newton knew this 400 years ago, and Democritus knew it, what, 2,300 years ago, probably. We're still teaching things that we shouldn't be teaching. Well, look, I hope you found that interesting. There may be some time for questions, I don't know, but if you have any thoughts about the presentation or want to follow it up at any point, you can email me. My email address is s.westland@leeds.ac.uk. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Steve, thanks very much for that. Big virtual round of applause. What a great talk. It had everything: depth, examples, controversy, everything. Thank you so much for that. Now, this is the point when people can turn on their microphones and ask questions if they, or they can write them in the chat. And I'm going to keep my eye on the chat, and I can read out or Rachel can read out questions in the chat. So we could maybe start off with some questions. I mean, how do you think misconcept? I mean, to me, it's as a biologist, it's probably it's not very surprising that color is in our perception and how we process it. But how do you think that this kind of seems to have, these misconcepts seem to have entered? Because they're not necessarily kind of simple misconcepts, really.
That's a really interesting question, Eric. In terms of the idea about light being colored, I think we've evolved to experience the world that way. It's actually to our advantage to use color as a cue in the world to do things.
Yes.
But interestingly, if you take something like if you take light, the physical stimulus is light, which hits the eye, and there's a process which results in the perception of color in our heads. Say you take pain. If you put your hand on a hot stove, the stove has heat, which is a physical property, and you perceive that as pain. Nobody would say that the pain is the property of the stove. Right? But to me, it's the same. It's exactly the same. And if people say color doesn't exist, I would say, you know, like Democritus would say, you know, if there was no living creatures on the planet, there'd be no colors, no tastes, no sounds, no smells, no pain, no joy. The fact that there are living creatures, and we do have all those things, doesn't make them not real. They're just not intrinsic properties of objects. You know, pain and color are equally real, right? But they're not properties of objects. So the answer to your question, Eric, is that I think it's been useful in our evolution of color vision to experience colors as if they are properties of the objects. And there's other things the visual system does, which is color constancy, which some of the people in the audience might know about, where despite the fact the light source changes and you think the color of the object will be changing, things tend to stay the same color. The visual system adapts for that.
Yeah.
Because it's actually really important that we can recognize things by their color. So that's that one. You know, if I talk very quickly about the thing I mentioned at the end, why do people think you can mix all colors by mixing red, yellow, and blue primaries? It turns out, by the way, you can't make all colors by mixing any set of 3 primaries. You can't do it additively, you can't do it subtractively, you can't do it theoretically, you can't do it practically. Why do people think this? I think in part because, again, of language problems. So, for example, somebody might have said, oh, do you know, you can make all hues by mixing 3 primaries, which you can. Not just red, yellow, and blue. It's pretty easy to choose 3 colorants or 3 lights and mix them together and make all hues. But hue is not color. It's an attribute of color. But for some people, they use the words very loosely. For some people, the words hue and color are used as synonyms. So one person says, oh, you can make all the hues by mixing these 3 primaries. And then that person repeats it to their friend, but they say, do you know what I just heard? You can make all colors by mixing 3 primaries. And bang, it's happened. The misinformation has happened because someone has confused the words color and hue. Yeah. There are some other reasons about that one, but there may be other questions. So someone said, is there an analogous relationship with sound? I mean, it's quite interesting because I was actually in court in New York, and I was on the stand for a day and a half in a really high-profile court case about color. I can't and won't go into details, of course, but I will say that the opposition lawyer said to me, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there, does it make a sound? And he was trying to ridicule my assertion that color was a perception and sound is a perception. But I was very clear. It's, to me, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around, does it make a sound? It's not a conundrum. It's quite clear that there is no sound. What happens? The tree falls in the forest, there's a movement of air, a wave of air, movement of air. It's only when that air hits the auditory apparatus of a living being that it activates a process that results in the perception of sound. It's really clear, right? There's a really clear analogy that sound and color and taste and smell and pain, for example, are all perceptions. None of those would exist in the universe if there were no sentient beings to perceive it. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that.
So there's a question there from Leandro Estrada, Stephen, about yellow response and reflectance. I think that's a rather technical question, but
well, let me look at it. It might be a technical question. Well, unfortunately, I can't answer it simply because I don't know what the questioner means by YL or even AVG. But Leandro, if you want to email me about it, I will happily reply. that one.
I think there is something in there now, but I mean, can I? I mean, that might seem a slightly crazy question. Is I mean, I guess color is something that can't be patented. I mean, is there any evidence? I mean, is there any sort of feeling that the industry wants to claim colors, or what happens with this?
That actually, Eric, that is an incredibly interesting question. To be honest, I don't teach or research the topics in this lecture. You can imagine, it's just something I have an interest in.
Yeah.
I teach much more practical things to do with technology and science and design. One of the things that comes up a lot is to do with protection of color. It turns out it's very, very difficult to patent a color. But what you can do is you can trademark it. So there have been some really high profile cases. For example, over the last 20 years, there's been a very long running dispute between Cadbury and wanting to trademark the color purple, and some other confectionery manufacturers who've been using it. Of course, Cadbury would claim that they're trying to pass themselves off, as that's a legal term. So you can't patent it, but you can trademark it, and you can sue people for infringement of trademark. So there is some legal protection for people who want to use color.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a really interesting field, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
I was going to ask you, how long ago were you able to stabilize those amended contentions, your B1 to 4? And I was just wondering, maybe there were people, centuries ago who had an instinct that your now settled view on this, it was how it should be seen, but they didn't have the techniques to demonstrate what you've been able to demonstrate just now. So sorry, that's two questions.
No, I think that's a very good question, actually, Rachel. When we talk about the cones in the eye, and I didn't show their spectral sensitivities, but although we've suspected their existence for at least 100 years, we weren't actually able to measure the spectral absorbance of cones in humans until about 1964, right? Some of the stuff is quite new, but until about 20 years ago, nobody suspected that females could have a fourth cone. But there was some research at Oxford and Durham University in the last 20 years that have shown that some females have got a fourth cone. And we now know that some of those females can actually can discriminate colors that mere mortals, such as me, a poor trichromat, can't tell the difference between. So some of them anecdotally said, I'm always arguing with my husband about whether two colors match, right? And she can see them differently. He can't. But the people concerned have done some work now and have shown some, not all, of these tetrachromats have this almost super color vision. But the point is, I think this is your point you're making, Rachel, is that we're not saying that females developed this fourth cone 20 years ago. That would be startling if it was true. It's suspected that that's been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And probably we evolved that fourth cone, and females evolved that fourth cone to better able to distinguish subtle shades of skin color in infants in order to tell whether they're sick or healthy, right? It's simply that in the last 20 years, we've had the technology to be able to detect its presence. So the answer to your question is yes, technology is still developing. We're still finding things out, which is the amazing thing. But at the same time, some things have been known for a very long time. So, for example, there's a particular person called Itten, who's very famous in color design. He was a member of the Bauhaus in Germany, the design school. And he produced some thinking about color. He was really the proponent of the red, yellow, and blue idea. His color circles showing red, yellow, and blue, making all the other colors in about 1930. And what people say that is when he produced that, he was already 50 years out of date. In other words, he was ignoring findings in vision science and psychology that had been known since the late 1870s. So, you know, this problem of misinformation and confusion has been going on for a very, very long time, and I suspect will continue to go on.
It's very difficult, isn't it? Once a notion, and usually a sort of simplistic and easy to grasp version of something that's actually much more complex and subtle, when it gets out there, it's in so many areas that's very difficult to overturn. You know, there's a sort of defamation strength. Very difficult to unpack. Eric, I see that the time's going on, but maybe there are some other questions that we should be.
Well, I think Elizabeth Allen has asked a question about.
I'm just having a look for it now.
Yeah, I'm having a look at it too. Yeah.
Well, it's not a question exactly. It's a comment really, which I share. You know, remember the comment I said about the flat Earth, right? The misinformation about color is being taught at preschool, junior school, secondary school. It's in textbooks. You know, and they teach you can make all the colors by mixing red, yellow, and blue. There is no practicing artist who would ever do that. Because why would you see all those boxes of paints with all those loads of different colors in if you only need 3? Because every practicing artist knows that if you were to try to mix all your colors from 3, most of them will be dirty brown. You just lose. You get all the hues, but you lose so much. You lose so much saturation. It's known. It's been known for a long time. But the people who teach in universities and colleges and schools that you can make all colors by mixing red, yellow, and blue are people who were taught in universities and colleges and schools you can make all colors by mixing red, yellow, and blue. In other words, it's based on an ideology which they've been taught. It is not based on practice or empiricism. Now, the problem we've identified in the Colour Literacy Project is colour theory, which is what it is called, this whole thing, is actually divorced from practice. And what should really happen is practice or empiricism should drive theory, not the other way around. Yeah. You don't start with theory. If you do, if the data or empiricism doesn't support it, you throw it away.
Yeah.
You know? Data or observation is the king. You know. But unfortunately, it's a problem that colour theory has become divorced from practice.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think actually it's 8:45. Actually, I think probably we ought to draw this to a close. And Stephen, I think this is, by far and away the most kind of thought-provoking and controverse stimulating talk we've had for a long time on something as simple as what we're looking at right now around us, it's a great comments that people accept things without testing them, and all of us experimentalists here go firmly on your side on that one, You've got lots of terrific comments coming in here from the audience. I'm going to just sort of mention that some people couldn't get in at the beginning. It has been recorded, and we will be, but Rachel, I think we will be giving everybody the link, and everybody who registered will get the link. So can check up on the any points you missed or listen to the whole talk again. So thank you again very much, Stephen. We really appreciate that.